We would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining into today's webinar. My name is Kara Oostros, and I'm a field editor with Real Agriculture. Before we get started here today, a few housekeeping items. If you have to leave early, recordings of this webinar will be posted on the school's website and also on our YouTube page. Recordings of all our past webinars can be found on our YouTube page, so go back into those archives. There's been lots of great conversations so far. Be sure to check those out. We will have time for a Q&A discussion. This will be a panel. First off, we'll have all three of our panelists speak, but then we will have opportunity for questions. So please keep those questions in mind. And I mean, I know it's so easy to forget those questions, so feel free to send them in right away. And if there's any specific person you're asking them to, then please let me know as well, and I'll make sure that specific person gets the question. So I'm very much looking forward to today's discussion. It's going to be a good one. The post-COVID economic recovery is on the minds of many Canadians. What can our governments do to help restart the economy while not incurring further major debt? One action is to reduce the interprovincial trade barriers to businesses, lowering costs and adding GDP, sorry. It's a story as old as Canada. Outdated and inefficient barriers are hurting us, especially in fields like agriculture. So our discussion today will surround why these barriers exist, what the magnitude of lost GDP potentially is, and what actions could be taken to reduce them. We will discuss the issue in general terms and then focus in on the impact specifically on Canada's agriculture industry and how changes to these policies can help the country's economic recovery. So our panelists today, we have three wonderful speakers here ready for you. The first one we're going to have on is Crystal Wittenvrangel, and she is a public policy analyst at the Montreal Economic Institute. A four-time University of Calgary alumna, Crystal received a BA and Bachelor of Science in 2012, an MPP in 2017, and a Master of Science in 2021. Her research interests are wide-ranging and broadly include studying the design, implementation, and evaluation of public policies and the potential impacts of proposed policies. She has published in a number of specialized academic journals, and she occasionally contributes to the Financial Post and other Canadian media. As well, today joining us, we're going to have Trevor Tombe. Trevor is a professor of economics at the University of Calgary and a research fellow at the School of Public Policy. His research, which focuses on economic and fiscal integration, international trade, and fiscal federalism, has been published in top economic journals, such as the American Economic Review, Journal of Monetary Economics, and the Canadian Journal of Economics. He also serves as a graduate program director in the Department of Economics, is on the editorial board of the Canadian Journal of Economics, and is co-director of finances of The Nation. In addition to his academic research and professional service, he is deeply committed to promoting the public understanding of economics through public policy and active media engagement. Last but not least, we have Gerald Carlberg, who is a professor of agribusiness and agricultural economics at the University of Manitoba. His main research focuses upon issues in agricultural marketing, especially cattle and beef pricing and supply chains, but he also has an interest in the economics of food and nutrition, especially as they relate to the public cost of food-related chronic diseases. Dr. Carlberg was raised on a family farm at Osage, Saskatchewan, and completed undergraduate degrees in both finance and economics, as well as a master's degree in agricultural economics at the University of Saskatchewan, before receiving his doctorate in agricultural economics from Oklahoma State University in 2002. So, as I said, we have a wonderful lineup here today. Some really great conversations are going to happen. And first off, we're going to start with Crystal. So Crystal, take it away whenever you are ready.
Great. I'm just going to share my screen quickly here. Let me know if I don't do this successfully, which it looks like I have already not done successfully. Sorry about that. Okay. Sorry, everybody. I'm having a bit of a tough time today with making this work. Okay.
No worries, Crystal. Do you have your you have the slides ready there?
I do, yes. I am just trying for some reason here.
Bear with us as we get them going. Oh, looks like we might have something coming up there.
Okay.
Crystal, do you need us to share the slides for you?
Is this sharing now? Is my screen sharing?
Yes, I believe so, yeah.
Are you just seeing the slide or the presenter view?
I'm seeing the Interprovincial Trade, the real barrier to post-COVID recovery is what we are seeing on this end.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your patience with that. And also thank you so much for having me here today. I greatly admire the work of both Dr. Carlberg and Dr. Toom, and so it is a tremendous honor to be participating alongside them both. Today we will be talking about barriers to interprovincial trade, and I have found that in talking to my friends and family about the topic, that many don't think we have any barriers to trade in Canada, or they really don't know exactly how this plays out in practice. So not only do I think it is a very timely topic as we struggle with a post-COVID economic recovery, but it is an important conversation for Canadians to be aware of and a part of, especially in our current context of international uncertainty and large deficits. One of the primary purposes of Confederation was to create a single internal market, but over time, each province and territory has introduced laws and regulations that act as barriers to the free movement of goods and services within the country. Ironically, as international trade agreements have removed barriers between Canada and other countries, barriers within Canada have tended either to be raised or maintained. There are prohibitive barriers which stem from provincial and territorial laws, such as those surrounding alcohol sales, like we kind of talked about earlier, technical barriers that result from different sector-specific regulations, such as those around certain tire use in the trucking industry, and regulatory and administrative barriers, which arise from variations in permits, licensing, and other administrative requirements that are imposed on Canadians and Canadian businesses. Studies estimate that the many regulations on interprovincial trade impose the equivalent of a 6.9% tariff on goods crossing these internal borders. Other studies have shown that these barriers create artificial costs for Canadians as producers, consumers, and taxpayers, and their elimination would result in increased productivity, increased labor mobility, and increased GDP. Construction is a great example of an industry where there are a number of barriers that are costly for Canadians. For example, a construction worker in Quebec is required to be a member of an approved union, all of which operate only in Quebec. This constitutes an effective obstacle against out-of-province construction firms in bidding for works in Quebec, even with the proper qualifications and administrative authorizations. Another example is in the recognition of qualifications. The Construction Commission or Association in many provinces does not always automatically recognize qualifications obtained in other provinces. While there are existing deals between certain provinces, the only pan-Canadian deal is for the apprentice grade. This serves as a barrier to the free circulation of labor. Another regulatory barrier is in the differences in construction codes used across the country. This results in high compliance costs due to the multitude of variations in building, fire, plumbing, and energy efficiency codes, as well as additional costs and red tape for companies wishing to operate or build in different locations across the country. The provinces and territories have committed to identify and eliminate these variations in construction codes by 2025, and the economic benefit to Canada as a result of this harmonization has been estimated at between $750 million and $1 billion by 2028. The Canadian Free Trade Agreement is a pan-Canadian free trade agreement that was signed in 2017. The expressed objective of the CFTA was to reduce or eliminate the free movement of persons, goods, services, and investments within Canada, and to establish an open, efficient, and stable domestic market. The CFTA takes a negative list approach, which means that the rules of the agreement apply automatically to almost all areas of economic activity, unless an explicit exception is noted. Despite the objectives of this agreement, these exceptions make up nearly half of the overall agreement, and they allow trade barriers to remain. The CFTA also establishes a regulatory reconciliation and cooperation table, which identifies and eliminates regulations that create trade barriers. For example, it was the RCT that identified and worked to eliminate the differences in the construction codes in the previous example. In addition to the RCT, there have also been unilateral actions taken by governments. For example, between 2017 and 2021, Alberta reduced its explicit exceptions to the CFTA from 27 to 6. This graph shows, on the y-axis, the number of trade barriers as defined by explicit exceptions listed in the CFTA between its signing in 2017 and the beginning of this year. Alberta has the lowest number of exceptions currently to the CFTA, followed by Manitoba, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan. If we look to Quebec, it has almost 6 times as many exceptions to the CFTA as Alberta, and Yukon and New Brunswick are not much better. As you can also see, between 2017 and 2021, only Alberta, Manitoba, and Ontario have progressed in the spirit of the CFTA and have worked to improve their openness to trade in the form of reducing exceptions to the CFTA. For all others, there have been very few concrete attempts since then. While Dr. Toom and Dr. Karlberg will be digging deeper into the economic impacts of trade barriers, the benefits of liberalizing interprovincial trade are widespread: increased productivity and labor mobility, and increased GDP, to name a few. Although some progress has been made, Canada still has a long way to go. According to the 2019 World Economic Forum's Global Competitiveness Index, we ranked 32nd in domestic competition and 53rd with respect to the prevalence of non-tariff barriers. The 2021 federal budget pledged $21 million over 3 years to tackle the removal of these interprovincial trade barriers. For businesses and industries affected by these restrictions, this is a long-awaited positive step towards increasing Canada's competitiveness. Now, we need to see actual progress, which will require the engagement of provincial governments, as well as federal collaboration on policy changes. Once again, thank you so much for having me here today, and we can move right on to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And I'm seeing your guys' questions come in, so thank you very much. Keep them coming for sure. As I said at the beginning, if you have any specific questions for any of our specific speakers, please let me know and we will answer them once we get to the end of the presentation. So next up on our list is Dr. Trevor Toom. Do you want to take it away, Trevor?
Sounds good. Well, thank you, Kara, and thank you for everyone taking the time this morning to join us today. And I'm going to maybe take a little step back to think about what the economic implications are of internal trade barriers in Canada and the potential gains from expanding internal trade flows. And I think what we're looking at here really tells a big part of the story about what the challenge is and what the economic opportunity is for Canada as well. So here we're looking at using data updated just this morning from Statistics Canada, the size of internal trade volumes relative to Canada's economy in blue. That's at about 18% today, which is actually, looking back historically over the last 40 years, the lowest level of internal trade that we've ever seen since we started recording data in this way. And notice that since 1990, it's been relatively flat, sometimes rising a bit, sometimes falling, but basically that stable share of internal trade at about under 1/5 of the economy contrasts very sharply with what you see in red, which is international trade volume, so external trade. Early in the 1980s, internal and international trade flows were, as you can see, roughly similar. But with international liberalization, trade agreements with the United States through NAFTA, now more recently with Europe and TPP, we have seen a growth of international trade volumes at a pace that exceeds overall economic growth in Canada, whereas we haven't seen the same kind of liberalization and growth internally. So that's the challenge. The opportunity is that, well, this is still a meaningfully large share of economic activity in Canada. So at 18%, that basically means that if we can lower internal trade costs by just 1%, then we would see gains roughly, back of the envelope estimate here would be 1% of that 18%, or about 0.2% or so. But that's $4 billion per year in economic gains for each 1% reduction in internal trade costs. And this is also not evenly distributed across the countries. Internal trade matters a lot more for some regions than others. So here again, we're looking at the latest data from this morning about how important interprovincial trade is for each region of the country. And you can see quite clearly that smaller, generally lower income regions, the Maritimes, Manitoba, the territories, these are regions where internal trade is much more important than for larger, higher income regions. And so the gains are actually not just large overall, but also would tend to shrink the gaps between higher income regions and lower. So there's both efficiency and equity gains available from lowering interprovincial trade barriers. Now, these estimates, as Crystal noted, there are a number of them. I think the best estimates that she cited just a moment ago was recently published in the Canadian Journal of Economics. They have a range at the lower end of about 6.9%. So it depends on the method, and we don't need to go into the details there. My own estimates that are broader and includes service sectors as well find costs between a little under 8 to nearly 15% overall. And in agriculture, really a focus of a lot of our interests here this morning, those also exist, smaller than in other sectors, but still just a little shy of 5%. And this might not sound like a lot, but 5% is basically, think of it as a hidden GST on every transaction that crosses a provincial border. And so that's significant and can actually lead to lower productivity, lower GDP, and so on. Now, because of the importance of this issue, it hasn't been ignored by policymakers. There has been a lot of movement in recent years, a lot of agreements between some provinces. I think Alberta is one of the leaders, along with partners in BC, Saskatchewan, and most recently Manitoba in the New West Partnership Agreement. Now, that Canadian Free Trade Agreement that Crystal talked about is the most ambitious, I think, agreement by far, but there's still a lot to do. So what makes this agreement ambitious is, first, it's broad coverage, covering about 80% of GDP. It has a stronger dispute settlement mechanism. There are stricter procurement rules for governments, for example. And I think what's most important here is it creating some structure for momentum. Like, it sets up a number of regulatory reconciliation and cooperation frameworks, and discussions are ongoing. We have recent agreements on construction codes, energy efficiency, and with respect to agriculture, some recent agreements on easing some of the inspection burdens on products that can have really material reductions in the costs that businesses face when they ship across borders. Now, I mentioned that back of the envelope estimate of the potential gains from lower interprovincial trade costs. There's much more sophisticated methods that can be used to estimate what these gains are. And I'm showing some recent estimates here from two researchers and myself, published through the IMF in 2019, where we find gains for Canada as a whole of almost 4% if you can eliminate interprovincial trade barriers. And you can see with particularly large gains for the territories, Prince Edward Island, Newfoundland and Labrador as well. And that's significant. You know, a 4% increase in Canada's economy is large. We are a $2.3 trillion economy. And so boosting productivity by 4% is over $90 billion a year per year in economic output. And so this is significant. And therefore, the benefits of pursuing further liberalization are key. I'll note that the Canadian Free Trade Agreement is certainly, I think, I'm very optimistic about where it might go in the future, but a lot of effort needs to go into reaching agreements between governments. I do want to note that a single provincial government can access much of the gains from internal trade liberalization by moving unilaterally. So Crystal had a really informative slide moments ago about the exceptions within the free trade agreement. And we did see that Alberta dropped a lot of its exceptions and is moving now unilaterally to easing labor mobility restrictions, for example. It's a kind of side component of internal trade costs. And the more that a province can do to make it easier to import from other provinces, it can access most of the gains that are available to national liberalization, all provinces working together. So here I'm just illustrating some estimates from that IMF model that suggests that roughly 2/3 of the economic gains from trade liberalization can be achieved by a province moving unilaterally. And so to the extent that we can't get agreements, I still think there's a lot that provinces can do on their own. And so I really look forward to the conversation. And so with that, I'll end it here just by kind of summarizing overall that the economic benefits of easing interprovincial trade costs can't be overstated. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trevor. And next up, we are going to have Dr. Jared Carlbert come on to conclude the panel. And just friendly reminder, get your questions in, because part of this is that it's live and we love to have the discussion with you. So get them in and yeah, we'll go from there. How about her, Jared?
Thank you very much, Kara. Thanks to everyone who took the time to join today, and especially to my two esteemed colleagues who have done a great job with their presentations. Hopefully you can see my screen. Just a few slides. I really appreciated Trevor's comments, and I'm going to cite some of the results from the paper that he was just speaking about. Great work done a few years ago. And so my very short presentation is just going to be referring to, again, the potential gains that we would see from a reduction in internal trade barriers. So what are the causes and consequences from my perspective? I'm an agricultural economist and out of the University of Manitoba, grew up in Saskatchewan, as we noted at the start of the day today. So there are some of the internal trade restrictions that affect the agri-food sector are pretty well known. Provincial versus federally inspected meat products. We usually, something happens in the meat sector all too frequently. We think of them as kind of being a long time between occurring, but BSE wasn't that long ago, really. Last year, we had a number of meat plants shut down, of course, because of COVID concerns and spreading at plant. So we always seem to be taking kind of a reactive stance when these things happen. And personally, I think we need to be a little bit more proactive. But some of the restrictions we face, for example, are pretty well known. So provincially versus federally inspected meat processing facilities, where trade interprovincially in products from only federally inspected processors is generally what we see being allowed. We talk a lot about the purchase and transportation of alcoholic beverages. This, of course, is a favorite for Canadians because in order to deal with our long, cold winters, we do drink a little bit, and so movement of products. Why can't I buy cheap booze in my neighboring province and transport it to my home province? So there's a lot of these that we talk about a great deal. Some are less well known. One of the ones that I've been involved with a little bit has been licensing for agrologists. So the practice of agrology across Canada, not yet universal. There's good work being done by Agrologists Canada on that file. But for example, some very important agrology practices. There's still independent provincial licensing that prevents the movement of skilled labor across provincial borders. This reduces efficiency. It makes things difficult for producers and other groups that need skilled agrologists. And it's not that different from what Crystal spoke about in the construction industry in Quebec early in her presentation. So it's just a little bit frustrating. One of the things that you read about a little bit is how successful Canada has been. We always think of trade as being international trade. So we've done a great job. We've signed something like 41 international trade agreements since the last significant upgrade to our own internal trade policies. So we really focus on trade with other countries, and sometimes lose focus on trade among our provinces and reducing those barriers. And the costs are the same, really, economically. If as economists, we tend to like unfettered markets because they're efficient. And so they maximize benefits overall. Sometimes consumers win, sometimes producers win, but overall the economy wins. And when we impose restrictions on the free movement of goods and services, or when we impose other types of restrictions on an unfettered economy, and yes, there are circumstances where that's needed, but in general, when we do that, we impose what are called deadweight losses on society. So there are reductions in efficiency that have real economic costs that nobody gains. When we try to remove barriers to efficiency, sometimes, yeah, we do have to pick winners, but overall the economy gains. A deadweight loss is a bad thing and inefficient because it removes, there are no winners and only losers when that occurs. And another one I read about just today was transporting agri-food products or other types of products. And oh boy, you need better tires to cross the border and haul your produce into a different province. Well, it's the same road built by the same company in the same geoclimatic conditions. Probably the same tires would be okay. And that's just one of many examples that affect not only the agri-food sector, but really many sectors throughout the Canadian economy. So why do these restrictions exist? It seems pretty cut and dried, but like many things that seem pretty cut and dried, it isn't. So Section 121 of our Constitution Act seems to explicitly require the free movement of goods among provinces, but it doesn't happen. So Canada is viewed as a federation. I think we're a strong federation. Most of us are proud of that. We have a national identity, but we also have our provincial identities. Courts all the way up to the Canadian Supreme Court have consistently protected provinces' rights to impose restrictions on the free movement of goods and services among provinces. And this really rankles, I think, a number of people who say, well, it's pretty cut and dried. We kind of view Constitution as the ultimate legal authority in a country. And if you read the relevant section of that act, it's pretty clear. However, courts, again, have upheld the rights of provinces within the Federation to exert some self-identity and protectionism in this regard. And it's an area that is not easily settled. Another reason why restrictions exist is what some colleagues of mine writing a number of years ago, including a good friend and mentor, Hartley Furtan at the University of Saskatchewan, wrote extensively on rent-seeking behavior. So seeking things to protect your self-interest or the self-interest of your sector, and that's a perfectly natural thing to do. So if I'm in a position of control, if my sector is doing well, if I'm a producer that's or part of a sector that's producing something in a province and it would be potentially cause me losses or less profit if competition were permitted in from a neighboring province, then of course I'm going to work to act in a protectionist way. That's natural. And it is simply a reason that occurs. We also would have standards associations in neighboring provinces, and maybe the three prairie provinces, for example, could have one standard association for the right size of tires to operate on the prairies in the winter. But and that's just a hypothetical example. But boy, oh boy, none of the three associations wants anyone to lose their jobs in safeguarding these things. So there's a little bit of that too. There's a lot of reasons why these internal barriers exist, in my opinion. It's also can be very costly to change practices. If we were to open up trade, well, I'm going to lose revenue, or my producers are going to suffer, or maybe my consumers are going to suffer. That's not usually the case. So there could be costs associated with updating regulations, all sorts of reasons why these types of restrictions exist. So the paper that Trevor just referred to a few minutes ago, that he was a co-author on, excellent work, outstanding, certainly far beyond anything that I have attempted in this field. So hats off to him. He's the true expert here, I think, compared to myself, certainly. But they estimate the economic costs of internal barriers to trade in that paper through the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, and find again, and Trevor referred to this, that complete removal of these barriers would increase per capita GDP in Canada. So GDP, we throw that term around a lot. I see we've got about 100 people on the webinar today. Not everyone understands what that term means. It's just gross domestic product. It's a generally used measure of economic activity in a country. So an increase of 4% of GDP is around $92 billion, which is really a lot. And I think part of our problem is politicians sometimes think that the money produces all this, but it's you and me that are producing this money. And so $92 billion is a bigger deal to us, I suspect, than it is to some of the policymakers. But this is just what could result from removal of these internal barriers to trade. And so it's a very complex methodology that was used, and I'm sure a very good estimate of that amount. So we have in the agricultural and food sectors, which are treated in some ways differently in the paper as separate. But at the end of the day, and Trevor would be far more able to explain the methodology than I am, but that there could be really significant gains to our sector in agriculture and food from just a 10% reduction in internal barriers to trade. So in agriculture and food separately, looking at really, imagine you're a producer and you could reduce costs. Again, Trevor referred to this as sort of an imposed tax. Suppose we had an interprovincial tax of 5%. Well, it's a significant amount. None of us would be very happy if that tax were added. In fact, we're trying to accomplish just the opposite, which is to remove costs and inefficiency. But they really are not trivial. They're significant, and they do exist for reasons that economically we should be able to overcome. We have worked very hard to overcome trade barriers internationally, and it almost feels like we've forgotten to take care of business here at home, and it would not be that difficult to do. So the last thing I wanted to mention was just that there are great people working on this at the federal and provincial level, certainly the two senior levels of government, really people working on this very hard within sectors and subsectors of the agri-food economy in Canada. So there are great people working on this. They've made really good progress. Both of my colleagues this morning have spoken about the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, which has made great strides. So it's not that people aren't trying. The work is being done, and there are people that work on this stuff every single day, and it's paying off. We've seen, again, both of my colleagues referred to some of the regional trade agreements. The New West Partnership Trade Agreement was particularly recent and successful. CFTA has been successful, and we've seen the liberalization in the movement of goods and services internally, which has been a good thing. As international competition increases and margins are squeezed, right? Guys and gals out on the farm are the ones that are facing more competition, higher costs, more regulations, environmental farm plans, all of these sorts of things. Don't dump oil on the road, on the grid road in front of your yard anymore. I think this one we probably agree is a good thing. But there's always something making life harder for farmers. And so coming out of the COVID era, we hope we could start to do things to squeeze a few more dollars out of the bottom line. And if we can reduce internal barriers, make things a little bit better for this sector, hopefully it ends up with with dollars in the pockets of our producers and our processors. Labor mobility and agrology that I referred to earlier is an important component of this issue. I think having that skilled labor available to us and to farmers would be really good. And I like to see us just continue to be proactive. Unless something bad happened, now how do we deal with it? Let's try to make good things happen on the front end. And I know that sounds simplistic, but this is the ITB reduction is potentially an important component of that. So that's it for me. I'm sure there will be questions. Thank you so much, everyone, for taking the time to listen to what I had to say.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Jared. And Trevor and Crystal, if you guys could as well turn your cameras and microphones back on, we will enter into the Q&A portion of this panel. So Jared was right. We do have some questions coming in for sure. We're going to start off here. One of the questions coming in says, these additional costs have the effect of increasing food costs overall and therefore impacting food security for low-income Canadians. Is there some way we could work on these barriers to help in this regard? Anyone have any comments on that? Not so much.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I agree. Food security for marginalized and low-income Canadians is an incredibly significant issue. This is but one piece of that. There are inflationary pressures, downsizing of packaging. All these things are critically important for low-income Canadians. And yes, this is one part of that. And hopefully, I mean, I'm sure we've seen through COVID the increased prevalence of things like urban food deserts, where small mom and pop stores that all of a sudden couldn't have anyone come in the front door, while Costco was allowed to have 400 people inside. Not to pick it on Costco, pretty good store, but that's what I mean. I think a lot of things coming out of COVID have made things worse for our lowest income Canadians. And I wish I had better solutions, but I do agree that this is potentially important, as are many other things to those affected.
Okay, I will move on to the next question then. Do you think there's some breakthrough action that has to happen in order to lead the way to reducing these barriers? For example, the Free the Beer case that was in front of courts in New Brunswick a few years ago. Will this test change over time? Do you see potential? Trevor, you're nodding.
Yeah, and I was thinking about the precise words I would use, because I think we have, on the one hand, we shouldn't underestimate the importance of sustained gradual action through the free trade agreement. So at any given moment, it doesn't look like a lot of reform is taking place, but as long as these efforts to harmonize and ease regulatory burdens, or like with agriculture, removing multiple inspections for the same goods, if this is sustained over time, then that can compound itself and we can get some really significant gains when we look back over the span of maybe a decade or two. So that's one thing to keep in mind. But dramatic action, I think, is unlikely to be seen in a multilateral context between all of the provincial governments. But you could imagine a single provincial government taking a big, bold, unilateral action to basically mutually recognize, for example, the regulatory certifications, professional standards, and so on that exist in another province. They can just say, well, if you passed an inspection in Ontario, or you meet the standard of British Columbia, then you automatically meet whatever standard exists in Alberta without the need for any additional paperwork or filing or recertification or what have you. So no provincial government has, I think, taken that step. That would be the bold, dramatic action that would be, in my view, a game changer. And there's some political challenges to that, of course. And what we've seen in Alberta might be an interesting baby step in that direction with respect to recognizing credentials of workers from other provinces. They aren't going to automatically recognize them, but they've put a clock on the review for Alberta professional, the industry associations that effectively do the regulation. They said, you need to make a decision within X number of days. And so that might ease some of the barriers, and maybe we could see that being spread to other areas or trade in goods.
Anyone else have any other comments on that?
Yeah, I'll just add to the kind of the Free the Beer piece. Often these small homegrown campaigns gain traction and they gain visibility and they elicit conversation. And often that is a big part of bringing this to the surface. There's so many regulatory pieces that aren't listed in the CFTA because there are differences in specifications, and so they're not known. So bringing these things up, having these conversations, I think is a big part of realizing that there are these duplications and there are these kind of messy, muddy pieces that create the barriers. So whether or not that is going to create change, I think it creates conversation, which has the potential to create change.
Okay, yeah, those are some great comments. Another kind of comment here I'm going to get you guys to comment on is CFTA exemptions. Isn't removing the exceptions from the agreement only part of the story? If the legislative and regulatory frameworks supporting those exceptions remain in place, all removing exceptions does is open the CFTA party up to potential liability. How do we feel about that?
Yeah, that's an excellent point to keep in mind. That these exemptions are not the only trade costs that exist, and dropping them and therefore means liberalization. I think what we should view them as was the way that Alberta tried to signal that it was taking the issue more seriously than in the past. COVID really kind of, I think, interrupted a lot of maybe what the government was planning in that space. But I viewed it as just a signal of a commitment to liberalization rather than actually really itself liberalizing much.
I'm getting some nods. Looks like everyone's in agreement there. Crystal, there's a question specifically for you here. In the study you had referred to, which were the countries that had the least internal barriers to trade?
Study that I referred to, I'm not sure which study there. I know Australia has done some work between its provinces in working towards that has been pretty beneficial to reflect on in our own context. I'm not sure the exact study that I was referring to. The one that I did refer to was that 6.9% tariff, but that was in reference to here within Canada.
Okay.
Maybe I'll jump in there. This method that was applied by the Statistics Canada team, published in the Canadian Journal there, that arrived at that 6.9% number for Canada, when that same method is applied to interstate trade flows in the US, you don't get an estimate that's statistically different from zero. And so at least between Canada and the United States, there's evidence that internal trade barriers may be larger in Canada than there. I think a trouble in this research area is most countries don't actually have a lot of good data on internal trade. So Canada's lucky in that we do have the ability to measure things in a much more detailed way than other countries.
And keeping on the trend of internal trade barriers, we have a question here saying, what is your sense of internal trade barriers with the far north? Some of those are due to lack of infrastructure as well as regulations. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, I'll cite a paper published through the School of Public Policy here, I think 2 years ago. I'm sorry, drawing a blank on the exact year, but with myself and my colleague here, Professor Kent Fellows, who we dive into the territories specifically, product by product, separating all three. Economic gains for them are pretty significant. And a big part of the story we find is related to transportation infrastructure. And so the ability to ship goods from point A to point B, that's a trade cost if you have low quality roads, or in some areas no roads at all. And so we find that the per kilometer trade cost for shipments to and from the territory is about 40% higher than for equivalent distances between provinces. And so a big part of the territorial trade costs about infrastructure. And so that paper, I'd recommend taking a look at it at policyschool.ca, is also kind of contributing to this conversation around the potential for infrastructure corridors to ease the ability to build new road, rail, and so on in Canada, which would have particularly large benefits for the territories potentially.
Okay, great. Thank you. So another question here, what about the concern by provinces that are very dependent on interprovincial trade, that are concerned they will shrink their economy if they remove these barriers because outside products are cheaper? Is this a real concern? And if so, how can we manage these concerns?
So, like with international trade, there's always winners and losers from a change in trade policy. There are certainly some sectors in some provinces that would shrink in response to easing interprovincial trade barriers, but there are other sectors that would grow. And we do need to keep in mind that those economic benefits do tend to be larger than the economic costs, which is not to really to suggest we should ignore those costs. I think governments have a role to play in terms of helping facilitate adjustment and retraining, or these sorts of ways to shift workers and capital and businesses out of areas where a province might not have what economists call a comparative advantage, and help shift that into those other areas where those economies could grow. So there certainly is, and that's part of the political challenge, in the sense that those who are import competing, they tend to know it, whereas the economic benefits tend to be much more broadly distributed and harder to identify, which makes the lobbying against liberalization much harder than lobbying in favor. And that's not unique to internal trade. That's a challenge that governments face on trade policy generally.
Absolutely. Jared, I see you nodding down there. You got more comments?
Just to add to what Trevor has said, and he's absolutely right. It can frequently be the case in economics that the efficiency gains are significant enough that we can actually compensate the so-called losers with the gains that are made, and either partially or fully compensate them because the gains in efficiency are significant enough. So it is a good question, and there are, as economists, we tend to pursue efficient outcomes, but it's also the case that frequently those outcomes are efficient enough to compensate almost fully or fully those who have lost by, in this case, liberalization.
We got a question here that says, do we need a crow rate for moving food and other necessities to the Canadian North to incentivize growth of the area until it can hold its own? So a subsidized pet, pretty low transportation cost for necessities. Is that something you think we need to have?
So I guess in part we already do, and I really can't say whether it's sufficient or not, but I'm thinking about programs like Nutrition North Canada, where there is in place implicit subsidies to help offset some of the higher transportation costs for food in particular. And so whether that goes far enough or not is a good question, but certainly there's a case, at the very least on equity grounds, to ensure access to sufficient food, especially nutritious food, which is particularly costly to get up to the Northern Territories. And I mean, yeah, I guess I'll just stop there to be like, yeah, there is some subsidy programs that exist that maybe need to be thought about.
We have kind of a longer question here. This attendee says she does some consulting in the BC wine industry. So the BC government unilaterally lowered internal barriers to other Canadian wine ordered directly for personal consumption in 2012. Other big wine producing provinces continue to protect their domestic industries. She says, looking at you, Ontario, do you think this sticky issue will be fixed multilaterally, politically, or is there a policy mechanism that will allow, so for example, Premier Ford in Ontario to gracefully lower Ontario barriers to other Canadian wine? Do we have any comments there? Trevor's nodding like he's got some thoughts.
Well, so liquor gets a lot of attention on this issue for sure, even though it's a much broader concern than just the access to a wide variety of beer and wine from across the country. I think the challenge here really is about government procurement, which is where some of these trade agreements like the CFTA can potentially have more bite than in other areas. I guess we'll see whether governments follow through. The additional challenge is that liquor, because it's run through government monopoly wholesalers, there's some revenue implications for provincial governments liberalizing trade in alcohol. So I think that's maybe part of the challenge.
Yeah,
Kristen?
I'll have a funny one. Out of all of the exceptions in the CFTA that are listed and explicit, alcohol is one of the big ones that most provinces or a lot of provinces have their exceptions to. And then, like we kind of mentioned before, there are smaller pieces of technical specifications that aren't listed there, whether it's, beer bottle size or, those sorts of things. I can't quite remember exactly the pieces of the question, but it is possible to make unilateral moves, as we've seen with Alberta, for example, with dropping a lot of their exceptions. And so it's possible, that's for sure.
And playing off of that actually leads really well into our next question. Despite the signing of CETA, progress on its mutual recognition of professional qualifications, or MRPQ, appears to have stalled, with Alberta recently removing barriers for interprovincial professional qualifications. To what extent do the panel think removing internal barriers is complementary to removing PQ's barriers with other countries in current or future free trade agreements? And alternatively, does interprovincial PQs make MRPQ as part of FTAs less appealing?
Well, maybe I'll start just by commenting on the Alberta move. So this is not removing barriers in the case of Alberta. It's easing them, and it's hard to say by how much. Hopefully by more than zero. So what it's doing is putting a time limit on how long these reviews can be taken for those industry and professional associations to complete their review of the credential that the individual in question has. That hopefully does make it easier. It maybe will prompt these associations to think of different ways of engaging in reviews and checking the certification. So I think it's a small step, certainly in the right direction, but I wouldn't overstate the significance that it has. I think what an MRPQ, or like the M and the R there, is very important. Mutual recognition. I think a province could, if it wanted, just recognize any credential issued by any other provincial government with a snap of a finger. So if you're a licensed podiatrist in one province, then you can just move in and instantly you are qualified, and no need to check or file paperwork or anything to practice here in Alberta. That's very much complementary to trade costs because it's something that affects trade and services. So Manitoba, for example, you cannot offer legal services to clients in Manitoba unless you have a physical office there. So that's a barrier to the trade in legal services. So I hope that provincial governments go further, and I hope that Alberta doesn't stop with what it's done, but it's something where a lot more work is needed, tied in directly with trade, and I think indeed is related to international credential recognition as well. I mean, if you are licensed in one area or another by a credible international government, then we should be making it a lot easier to recognize those skills.
Any other comments from the panel?
I just was going to add to the end of what Trevor was saying that Ontario recently put a bill forward that they're going to make it a little easier in the sense of recognizing the foreign trained professionals. Whereas Alberta, yes, we're focusing more on those that have Canadian experience and Canadian credentials. They've gone the other way of saying, let's look at this foreign experience as well. So that's it'll be interesting to see how that helps out or shapes labor market considerations moving forward in Ontario. And then who knows, maybe other governments like Alberta might take a step in that direction as well. It'll be interesting to watch it unfold.
Absolutely. And as you said, it is always changing. A question here. In our estimates, have we considered the government cost savings due to reduction in duplicated regulatory offices and people? Is that anything we've looked at?
Great question, and no, actually. So the estimates on the gains that I'm showing are really about broader economic productivity, but that questioner is absolutely right to highlight that there may be direct cost savings for governments too, especially with procurement. A lot of the biased procurement policies that historically and still in many cases do exist result in higher cost projects if you're not hiring those suppliers that have the lowest price in favor of a domestic within province supplier, then that's going to result in higher government expenditures than would otherwise be the case. So, but that's not something that I've seen comprehensive estimates on.
This is actually a question related to BSE. So when we saw BSE, some provinces attempted to respond with some smaller meat processing facilities that mostly did not survive due to the competitive nature of the industry. Is this a much simpler process when we consider products that are wholly sold in Canada, for example, milk products?
I'm drawing a blank, Jared.
I think the observation is correct, and I certainly looked at a lot of different aspects in the post BSE era, 2003 to 6, 7. There were unfortunately a lot of smaller plants that did fail because of the economies of size and scale and scope that exist in the meat packing sector because of the vertical integration that's taken place. I don't know that I'm able to comment really usefully on any comparisons there to the dairy sector. I think that the dairy sector and the supply managed sectors in Canada are important to the economy or the areas they operate in. They provide stable, secure income sources to producers engaged in those industries. They clearly impose higher costs on consumers, and that's a trade-off that governments have been willing to make historically and continue to be willing to make. So in terms of could there be a flow of a greater flow of products because of quota system that exists, for example, in dairy that that could affect the movement of raw milk, say, across provinces to processing facilities? It's a pretty complex question. I think it's a good thought. It's not one that I've considered very much, but there could be. That one is a really big topic. I think it's a good question. I don't have a strong opinion on it though.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to answer that one. So another question here, if internal barriers do have the large economic effects described, what explains the relatively low level of dispute settlement cases by firms and governments that are negatively commercially affected? Crystal, maybe you have thoughts on that one?
I mean, it's a great question. I think I don't know the answer to that, but my thoughts are some of these large scale gains that we've been talking about are a little bit more, what's the word I'm looking for? They're not concrete enough for the everyday person or the everyday firm to kind of conceptualize. In a sense, it's more, aggregate level estimates. And so, yeah, sorry, I'm answering a question by not answering a question because I don't know the answer to that.
Any comments, Jared or Trevor?
Yeah, I think it's helpful to keep in mind what internal trade barriers are and what makes them different from many sources of trade costs between countries. These are largely, as Crystal so effectively summarized in her talk, like regulatory barriers, like just differences in regulations between one jurisdiction and another. And so businesses can already engage with governments or elected representatives and public servants to push for regulatory changes or harmonization with other jurisdictions, but there's not really dispute at issue here. It's a firm that needs to deal with two different sets of regulations, and that adds costs. So it's not some kind of explicit charge that a business is faced with by a government to ship across borders that then they would, take issue with. This is about provinces being sovereign in their own spheres of jurisdiction. And so any differences between what one province adopts from what another adopts, that's the source of trade barriers. And so this is really about government to government harmonization efforts rather than disputes that you could imagine a business launching against a government.
Absolutely.
And
And
sorry, I just wanted to quickly add to that. Like, that's largely the role of the reconciliation regulatory piece that was established with the CFTA, the RCT. And so in the example that I mentioned about the construction codes, for example, with differing plumbing, electrical, energy efficiency, so on and so forth, by just harmonizing that, there was an estimated gain of, I believe it was 750 million to $1 billion over the course of a number of years. And so it's just a matter of efficiencies that come from firms being able to operate more seamlessly in other jurisdictions.
do any of you guys have any estimates on impact on wages of removing some of the labor movement barriers?
Not off the top of my head. And so we do need to keep in mind that a big effect of easing some of these barriers is lower prices. And so the kind of the relevant measure for our well-being and standard of living is what we call our real wage. So the wage level that you earn divided by the prices of goods and services that you face. And so the economic gains that were cited earlier is really a change in that real income level. And so that's going to be a combination of price changes mostly and income changes.
Another interesting thought here, it says we are talking about trying to work together with other provinces in order to help the overall economy. Any comments on how some provinces are very protectionist right now due to the economic challenges they see today? What else could the average consumer do to push their provincial governments to move more in the open trade direction? Anyone want to tackle that beast?
That's kind of an interesting political question. I think we've seen a lot of action over the past few years, I think, because there is an increasing recognition of the magnitude of the economic consequences of these barriers. And so having businesses and individuals remind their elected representatives to stay focused on that issue is, I think, it's moved the needle as far as I can tell over the past few years. And if this continues, then these efforts through the CFTA and the various processes there will hopefully continue as well. I wouldn't point my finger, though, at any particular provincial government. I think all have measures that contribute to trade costs. Many will not view them as protectionist because, again, it's just one jurisdiction adopting regulations that differ from another, not for the intended purpose of interfering with interprovincial trade flows, but it has that effect nonetheless. And so I think I wouldn't want to ascribe, motives to provincial governments here. It's just a consequence of having a decentralized federation, and it takes a lot of work to harmonize or mutually recognize what exists elsewhere.
Any other thoughts or additions to that?
Right to your MLA, I will ascribe motives to politicians, but I won't select any particular ones. They're mostly quite similar.
Okay, fair. Crystal? No? Okay.
Nothing.
Okay. Sorry. Then I think we are going to wrap up. We are quickly out of time here. Any last thoughts or remarks from any of our panelists today?
Oh, well, thanks for hosting the great conversation. It's certainly an important issue that there's no shortage of angles to think about, and I hope the conversation continues.
You bet. And sorry, Jared, you looked like you were going to say something.
No, just thanks as well. And Trevor referred a few minutes ago to the real wage. We seem to be entering a potentially significant inflationary period, and so it makes these gains that we can make all the more important. It makes it all the more important that we hold policymakers to task with respect to the decisions they make with respect to fiscal policy and the effects that's going to have on our standard of living. But thanks, Kara, and to everybody. It's been a lot of fun.
I'll echo both of these fine gentlemen and thank you for hosting the conversation and for all the participants and the great questions. I'm leaving with a few things to look into and think about myself, which is always a win in my books from something like this.
Absolutely. It's always great to get the different thoughts and the conversation going. And speaking of keeping the conversation going, please join in for our next upcoming webinars. We have one on November 23rd. It's called Soil Carbon Sequestration. What is it and can it actually work? So that'll be an interesting conversation. And the next one is December 7th. Are farms driving our GHG emissions? Climate policy for Canadian farmers. So once again, that will be another great talk. I will be hosting both of those, so tune in for that conversation, and I look forward to talking to you guys. And as I said at the beginning, if anyone is looking for any of our past recordings, or they came on this about halfway through and they want to catch the beginning, this will all go up on our YouTube page, as well as I believe on the public policy website. So please join in there, and thank you very much. And I hope you guys all have a great rest of your week.